This happened in the early 1990s when I was a junior in high school, 16 years old, female, and home on Christmas break. It was the middle of a weekday, and I was home alone when the phone rang. When I answered, a man asked for me by my first and last name. He then said, "This is Randy something or another from such and such company, and I was calling to..." I tried to interrupt to have him repeat his name and the company name because he said it very quickly and unclearly, but he ignored my question and asked if I had been looking for a job. I wasn't, but I was young and curious, so I hedged a bit. Randy then told me that he was hiring models for commercials and that someone had given him my name. I literally laughed because, one, that sounded completely fake, and two, I wasn't exactly swimming in modeling contracts. When I told him that I believed he must be mistaken, he replied, "No, I think you're very pretty, Tessa." While that comment might not seem disturbing to some, it had stopped me in my tracks. He had initially said that I'd been recommended to him, but now he was speaking as if he had seen me. At that moment, I just knew in my gut that something was very wrong. Unfortunately, I hadn't yet learned to get my brain and my gut on the same page. So while I wasn't buying anything he was selling, to be polite and maybe just in case there was some cash and an ego boost to be had, I said, "Okay, how about you just leave me your number and I'll talk to my parents and get back to you." I knew if he was legit, he'd have no problem giving me his number. Also, my brother had been asked to do a commercial or a print ad a few years before, and I knew my parents had to sign some forms because he was underage. Of course, Randy failed both of my tests and resisted giving me his number or allowing me time to talk to my parents. He encouraged me to just agree on the spot, so I promptly said, "No thank you," and hung up. Within seconds of hanging up, the phone rang again. When I answered, I'll never forget the first thing Randy said. "Do you give blowjobs with your eyes open or closed?" That escalated quickly. As I stood in stunned silence, he repeated the question and then moved on to similar ones. What made it unnerving, besides the obvious, was that it didn't sound like a prank call at all. Even though his comments were sexual, he sounded angry. I was safe in my home and it was just a phone call, but it made me feel like I was in danger. I hung up, of course, but he called continuously. So much, in fact, that every time I tried to pick up the phone to call my mom, he would either be on the line when I picked up or the phone would be ringing again. By this point, I wasn't answering the phone, and if he was on the line when I picked it up, I'd hang up quickly. But he was getting angrier, and his comments were taking a darker turn. What started as invasive sexual questions had turned into comments about how he'd like to harm me. I was finally able to get through to my mom and she called the police. They didn't seem to take it very seriously or act like they could do much. I didn't recognize his voice. It wasn't anyone I knew. And it wasn't a teenager, it was definitely a grown man. The police felt it was just someone messing with me and that it would fade out on its own, and for a time they seemed right. That first day he called constantly for a few more hours, but then the calls stopped. Although it was very disturbing, it seemed to be over. Some time passed and I quit thinking about it, but then spring break rolled around. It was the same scenario as before. I was home from school on a weekday, and I was alone. The phone rang, and when I answered, he launched straight into the vile sexual talk. I hung up and we began the same cycle. Him calling constantly and me trying to time it just right, so I could pick up the phone between calls and call my mom. Every time I hung up on him, he got angrier, and the things he said became more foul. This time, he started reciting my address and talking about paying me a visit. Not only did it feel very threatening, but it was so confusing. Who was doing this? Why would a grown man I didn't know make these calls not just once, but 2 times months apart? How did he have so much information about me? None of it made sense. When I finally got through to my mom again, she called the police and the officer took it a bit more seriously this time. They asked if we wanted to put a tap on the phone, and we agreed. The police told us the process. It would take 24 hours to get with the phone company and get it active. Once active, it would stay in place for 60 days. If there were no issues in 60 days, the tap would be removed. But if there were any calls, they'd be able to trace them. I was a teenager who wasn't speaking to the police directly, so I never fully understood the details. Were they recording all our calls and only listening if something happened? Or were they just tracing the calls? As you can imagine, being 17, I really wanted to know if people could hear my calls, but my mom didn't ask those questions. She just said that the police told her to let them know if we got any more calls once the tap was active. Just like before, the calls continued throughout the afternoon, but stopped by the time my parents got home. I received a few calls the next morning after my parents had left for work, but by the time the 24-hour window had passed, the calls had stopped again. And once again, things were quiet for a few more months. This cycle continued over the next year. The calls stopped after midsummer, then started again during Christmas break of my senior year. The pattern was always the same. The calls would start politely, but as soon as I recognized his voice and hung up, they'd become progressively angrier and more violent. They always came when I was alone and continued until my mom or dad had pulled into the driveway. We'd put the tap back on the phone each time, but the calls never lasted more than 24 hours at a time, and there was always at least 60 days between episodes. The content of the calls, however, became more personal. He would regularly mention my address, saying things like, "I know you live at 118 Charter Street," or "I'm gonna have to pay a visit to 118 Charter." Eventually, he began talking about my clothing, saying, "You look so pretty in that blue striped shirt." But then he started mentioning things I owned but didn't wear often, like, "When are you going to wear that red dress with the little white flowers?" This obviously took our fear to a new level. By this point, because the calls always stopped right before my parents got home, we knew he had to be in a position to see our driveway. Every day after school, I would let myself in the side door using a key that was hidden outside. It was extremely well hidden, and you'd have to be in just the right spot to see me get it. But if you were hiding and watching, it was possible. It became impossible not to think that he may have been in our house, in my room, and that thought was simply unbearable. We stopped leaving the key outside, but the nature of the cycle, short bursts of intense contact followed by months of silence, made it hard to know what to do. He clearly knew how to avoid being traced. He was motivated enough to keep contacting me over such a long period of time, and controlled enough to wait for long stretches between calls. I had never been someone who scared easily, and my dad didn't want me to lose that. He started keeping the guns in the house loaded and took me to the shooting range. I had shot plenty of guns before, but this was a serious refresher course. After Christmas, a few quiet months passed. As usual, I stayed alert for a week or two, then stopped thinking about it. On the first day of my spring break, I was home and in a great mood when the phone rang. Expecting a call from my best friend, I answered promptly and heard, "I'm calling about the job you applied for. This is Randy so-and-so from such and such company." I had been applying for jobs, but as soon as I said, "From where?" it hit me that this was the exact conversation we had the first time he called. I hung up and prepared myself for another awful day. The calls kept coming, and, as usual in the process of trying to call my mom, I ended up on the phone with him. The things he said had gotten worse after each quiet spell, and this time he was describing how he was going to violate and murder me. More than his words, it was the rage in his voice that triggered real fear. I was having trouble getting the line open long enough to call my mom, and I knew he was close enough to be watching the house. I got the gun out of the closet and sat by the ringing phone, wanting to call my mom but not wanting to risk hearing his voice again. I wasn't panicking, but I was crying and definitely scared. And then I was done. Just simply done. I picked up the phone and he launched into his sick spiel, trying to get as much in as he could before I hung up again. But I didn't hang up. I'm not sure why. I had no plan, but I sat there silently for a few minutes and let him talk. And when he said that he could be at my house in less than 2 minutes, without thinking about it for a second, I said, "Come on over, the door's open." I then hung up the phone, walked over and unlocked and opened the front door, leaving just the screen door closed. With the gun in my hands, I sat down on the couch facing the door and waited. He never came, and he never called again. There is zero doubt in my mind that if he had walked on that porch, I would have shot him, without hesitation. I still have no idea who it was, although there are a limited number of people it could be, or why, or whether it would have ever escalated beyond phone calls. I went off to college and my parents eventually moved out of that house, so I suppose it will forever be a mystery. I trust that God will give him what he deserves, but I definitely learned that people who feed off of your fear disappear quickly when you quit being afraid. This happened about 4 years ago when I was 20. The first time I met the guy who would become my grocery store stalker. He was standing outside the store collecting money for the Salvation Army Christmas donations. I'm a fairly friendly person, so I like to say hi to people who work at places I frequent, just to be nice. This guy was around my age, very tall with a mild resemblance to Lurch from the Addams Family. He had dark circles under his dark eyes, short black hair, and kind of a vacant look. I chatted with him for maybe 2 minutes, just idle chit-chat about the weather and other small talk, nothing particularly memorable. I waved goodbye and went home. Little did I know that brief moment would be the start of something that would genuinely make me afraid. About 4 or 5 months passed and I hadn't seen him again. One day, while grocery shopping with a friend, we were chatting when she suddenly got quiet and kind of recoiled, looking behind me. I turned around to see this guy who had to be at least 6'4", towering over me not even 8 inches away. He said hi and told me he remembered me from that December when I had talked to him, and then he asked for my number. I, being young and never having experienced this kind of interaction, told him I didn't have my number memorized, but that I would write his number down and text him later. I waved my phone at him, showing him my boyfriend's picture, which was my wallpaper, and made a point of saying, "Oh look, that's my boyfriend." I was hoping he'd get the hint, but no luck. He gave me his number, and as soon as I got it, I blocked him without giving him mine. However, what really made my blood run cold was what he said after I put my phone away. He leaned in real close and in a low voice told me, "Whatever I text you is for your eyes only." At that point, I started to feel really uncomfortable. I said, "Yeah, sure, nice talking to you, but we gotta get back to shopping," and grabbed my friend, dragging her off. I shot her a panicked look and asked why she didn't help me out. Apparently, she was scared too and didn't know what to do. I want to make it clear that I'm not exactly a small girl. At 5'8" and solidly built, I can handle myself and rarely feel intimidated. But this guy made me feel tiny and scared. Over the next few months, that feeling of fear would only grow stronger. I had hoped that creepy encounter would be the last time I saw him, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. After that initial meeting, it seemed like I ran into him every time I went to the store. No matter which checkout lane I was in, he always seemed to appear at the end of it when I was done shopping. Every time I was in the store, I noticed him watching me out of the corner of my eye. One time, I even caught him following me out to my car. I was scared and decided to tell the managers. They assured me they would tell him not to talk to me anymore. After that, he didn't speak to me, but I kept seeing him follow me around the store at a distance every time I was there. It got so bad that I became afraid to go grocery shopping at all. But I'm stubborn and refused to let him intimidate me into avoiding the store. I thought maybe it was a coincidence that he was always nearby, so I started paying close attention to my surroundings. Once I began to really observe, I realized that every single time I went to the store, he was always in the same area as me. The last time I saw him, I went to the store for just 2 or 3 items I needed for dinner that night. I first saw him standing outside the store when I arrived, so I quickly ran inside, hoping he didn't notice me. But a few minutes later, I saw him at the very back of the store. I grabbed my items and made a beeline for the front. As soon as I got near the checkout, I ducked behind one of the shelf displays and watched carefully to see if he would appear, and he did. He looked up and down the checkout lanes, and when he didn't see me, he stepped outside. I quickly ran to the nearest open cashier, rang up my items, and stuck my head out the door to check for him. Not seeing him immediately, I started making my way to my car. I had parked near the side of the store where a bunch of small shops and restaurants were lined up. As I was walking, I noticed him standing by the entrance I had first come through. I ducked behind a pillar, hoping he didn't see me. I watched carefully as he scanned the parking lot, but when he couldn't find me, he started walking towards the front of the store. Once he was far enough away, I made a run for my car. As soon as I got inside, I locked the doors. To my horror, when I looked up, he was standing about 15 feet away from my car, pushing a shopping cart. I knew he had followed me, and he knew I knew. I believe he had chased after me and then grabbed the nearest cart to make it look like he was collecting them from the lot. I remember feeling absolutely terrified in that moment. I went home and told my grandfather what had happened. I was crying and shaking, so he told me to get in the car. We were going to settle this. He drove me to the store and we demanded to speak to the managers immediately. When the managers arrived, my grandfather asked me to explain what had been going on and demanded that they make sure he left me alone, or he would involve the police. They swore up and down that they would take care of it. As far as I know, he wasn't fired immediately. My friend, who had been with me at the start, told me she occasionally saw him at the store when she was there alone, but he always avoided me if I was with her. Eventually, everyone who knew the situation stopped seeing him there, so I think he either got fired or moved on. Either way, I haven't had any issues since, but I've never felt as afraid of another person as I did that day. Seeing him make eye contact with me as I locked my car doors, it still creeps me out to think that he was watching me so closely that he could easily avoid or follow me whenever he wanted. So to the guy that stalked me every time I went grocery shopping for 4 months straight, let's never meet again. In August of 2020, I moved in with my aunt and uncle to an insanely small rural town in California. When I first arrived, a friend of mine made it a point to show me that you could drive across the whole town in 5 minutes. At the time, I didn't realize how important that fact would become to the safety of me and my loved ones. My best friend Haley and I, her being 17 and me 18 at the time, were hanging out at a park about a 5 to 10 minute walk from where I lived. When I say park, I mean there were a few tables and benches, and it was technically called a town park, but in reality it was more like a small grass clearing surrounded by woods with a dirt trail near the bank of a river. After moving, I started frequenting this place, walking down to the benches and trail to smoke or sit by the water. I had never noticed any suspicious people, even though I had been warned about a few creepers known to bother young girls in the area. Haley and I had been smoking for a bit, undisturbed in the clearing, when we decided to finish our time there by exploring the trail and taking in the scenery. We had been walking and talking for about 5 minutes when I started to feel this tension in my shoulders. You know that feeling you get when someone's watching you. I looked behind us, and there was a man on the trail. Granted, this path was pressed up against the side wall of a gated community, so it wasn't unusual to see people walking or jogging. I told my friend about the man, but she brushed it off, saying I was just being anxious. She had a point. I tend to be hyper-aware sometimes, but something about the man didn't sit right with me. We kept walking, and I periodically glanced back, keeping tabs on the dark-haired, middle-aged man walking about 50 feet behind us. Not long after, he started picking up his pace. His calm walk turned into more of a speed walk. I turned around completely and began walking backward to make it clear I was aware of his presence. The man moved toward the side of the trail, as if he were about to walk through the brush down to the river, and I felt a little foolish. I turned back around and walked forward again, but I glanced back one last time to make sure he was gone. That's when I saw the man in a full sprint coming straight for Haley and me. I grabbed her sleeve with one hand and pulled out my pocket knife with the other. I can't remember what I said to her, but we started sprinting down the trail too. I had never gone very far down the path, so I had no idea where it led. But the man was blocking our way back to the clearing and the road. We could hear his footsteps on the dirt getting closer. I let go of Haley's sleeve to pull out my phone and called my uncle. I told him we were being followed on the trail at the park, but I couldn't give him an exact location because I had never gone much further than the entrance and didn't know where it led. My uncle told me to stay on the phone and make as much noise as possible so he could find us. I let out the loudest, shrillest scream I could, and we kept running until we reached the end of the path. We came upon an old metal fence surrounding some trees and what looked like an abandoned house or shed. We also found ourselves at the back corner of the wall that surrounded the gated community, and in that split second it seemed like our best bet. I dragged us off the path into some trees near the cement wall and yelled at Haley to climb as fast as she could. I helped push her up so she could use a tree and the ledge to get over the top. I tossed my pocket knife and phone over the wall and somehow managed to scramble over myself as fast as I could. I landed face first next to Haley on a neatly trimmed patch of grass inside the gated community, startling a man who was just outside walking his dog. I suddenly became aware of how strange we probably looked. 2 panicked teenagers yelling and holding a knife. But the man seemed to realize we were in trouble. He came over to ask what was happening and if we needed help. As Haley explained our situation, I got back on the phone with my uncle and told him we had made it inside the gated community. Not even a minute later, we heard my uncle shouting from the trail, warning the man chasing us that he had a firearm and telling him exactly what he was going to do with it. The man walking his dog led us to a little access gate further down the wall and unlocked it so we could meet my uncle on the trail. My uncle told us that he had driven his car through the park as fast as he could, all the way up to the trail entrance, and then ran after us. But he hadn't seen the man on the trail as he was going. After checking to make sure we were okay, I explained what had happened with more detail than I could manage during my initial panic. My uncle escorted us back to the car, his firearm clearly visible and ready in case the man showed up again. We didn't see him on our way back, and I haven't returned to that park since. Anytime I left the house before I eventually moved, I was constantly paranoid that I was being followed. We were never able to figure out who the man was, and I haven't seen him since that day, but to the man on the trail, let's not meet. In my late teens and early 20s, I was friends with a girl named Lucy. She was a very lonely person whose parents were, honestly, really terrible. Her mother was verbally abusive and her father didn't seem to care about anything. Because of the lack of love in her life, Lucy would search through dating sites for comfort and attention from strange men, and she wasn't afraid of meeting them in person, even if they had only been chatting for a few days. My friendship with Lucy was complicated. I often found her annoying, but I also felt bad for her because of how lonely she was. Some days, I didn't want to hang out with her, and other days I'd accept her invitation. When it was just the two of us, she was fine to be around, and I could tell she appreciated the attention. We had a small group of friends, and Lucy would try to get us together as often as possible. When we all hung out, she became hyper and excited. It was obvious she was just happy to be around people who treated her better than her own family did. One day, Lucy told us she had a boyfriend. We were all surprised, considering she often talked to random guys online but had never mentioned actually dating one. A few days later, she arranged for us to meet him. None of us were looking forward to it, thinking he'd be just like the others, temporary and not serious. When we met him, it was awkward. He barely said a word and wouldn't look directly at any of us. Lucy tried to make jokes, but he only responded with cold, dismissive looks. It was clear he didn't care much for her, and we all thought he was weird. As time went on, Lucy told me that her boyfriend Trevor didn't like me. That was strange to hear, considering I'm usually polite and friendly, and no one had ever disliked me before. She said Trevor thought I was using her for her money, which it didn't make sense because I was always the one paying for things. I quickly got the impression that he was trying to turn Lucy against me. Trevor gave me a terrible vibe. He dressed like he didn't care about life and never smiled, didn't shake our hands when we met, and smelled strongly of weed. I just felt uncomfortable around him. For months, Trevor tried to convince Lucy to stop being friends with me. Eventually, she began to hide me from him. If we were hanging out and he called, she'd lie and say I wasn't there. If we were with our group of friends, she'd make sure to swear I wasn't around if Trevor asked. When he was going to join us for an outing or hang out at her place, she'd tell me I couldn't come. Lucy would do anything to please a boyfriend, no matter how unreasonable. Then things got scary. One day, Lucy called and asked me to hang out at her place. I agreed. She picked me up and we went to her house to watch TV for a while. After a bit, we decided to take her dogs for a walk to a nearby park, since it was a nice day. While we were at the park, Lucy got a phone call. This was unusual because Lucy was never the type to walk away for a private call, but this time she walked far enough away that I couldn't hear what she was saying. I found it suspicious, but I didn't question it at the time. When she came back, there was a strange look on her face, like she was trying not to smile. She told me, "I need to take you home now." I was confused because we had only been together for about an hour, and Lucy usually begged me to stay longer, even asking me to sleep over so she wouldn't have to be alone. Still, I agreed. As we drove, I noticed she wasn't heading toward my house. Where are we going? I asked. She smirked but didn't answer. I asked again, a little more nervously this time, but she still wouldn't respond. Then I realized we were heading toward Trevor's apartment. Panic set in. Where are you taking me? I asked, now angry. Her answer chilled me. Trevor wants to talk to you. I wasn't having any of it. I demanded she let me out of the car, but she kept repeating, "It's okay, he just wants to talk to you." I knew something was wrong. Why couldn't he talk to me over the phone? Why did I need to go to his sketchy apartment? She refused to let me out, even locking the car doors. I waited until we reached a red light, then grabbed her wallet from the back seat, took out her bus pass, and bolted out of the car. I had no idea where I was or where the nearest bus stop was, but I knew I had to get away. Lucy yelled for me to come back, but I ignored her. She sped off in a rage. I immediately blocked her number, unfriended her on social media, and warned our group of friends to stay away from her because something had changed. I haven't spoken to her since that day, and she lost all the friends in our group as well. Lucy, I hope you're truly lonely now. This is my brother's girlfriend's story. She doesn't have a Reddit account, but I told her about this subreddit, and she wanted to share her creepy experience to learn from it. I go to school in a big city that is one of the least safe in the US. I chose this nursing program, definitely not for the location. I live in a row house, that's what we call it, off campus with 4 other girls. It's cheaper and nicer than the dorms, or so we thought. I guess you get what you pay for. We are all girls and sophomores in college. As you might guess, we go out, drink, and sometimes do things we don't remember. We had just started our lease in August. The house has 3 floors and a basement, which was padlocked by the owners. Understandably, we would have definitely had parties down there to avoid immediate cleanup. The house was great, amazing location to the school and work. I'm a CNA who works odd hours, important for later. It was not expensive and in good condition. I had never lived with that many people before. I usually just had one roommate, so I definitely knew if someone had misplaced or changed something. I started to notice my snacks were either half gone or completely missing. I got annoyed, but with a house full of people, it was too much work to figure out who ate what, so I ignored it. Slowly, as girls do, we started making comments about someone eating our food, but in a passive-aggressive way, as college girls often do. We all just let it go because who wants to start a house fight? Eventually, we began to ask each other about it because it was getting annoying. I knew someone was taking our food, but who wants to admit to eating someone else's snacks? In college, snacks are a high commodity. We chalked it up to the girl who always smokes and eats her weight in food. She swore it wasn't her. This went on for about 2 months, and it became increasingly obvious someone was clearly taking our food. It had to be the girl who always smokes. I saw her eat her entire snack pantry in a single night. I wished it was her. One night at work, I was about to get off, but a situation arose and I ended up leaving at 12:30. I took the bus home. Don't worry, I carried pepper spray, a taser, and a pocket knife. I got home and was about to collapse. I wanted to go to bed ASAP. I walked in the front door and the stairs are directly in front of you. You can also see down the side into the kitchen. I walked in and saw someone in the kitchen, but I was too tired to say hi, thinking it could lead to a 30-minute conversation about nothing. So I went straight upstairs. When I got to the second floor, I noticed all my roommates' doors were closed, which usually meant they were either in their rooms for the night or asleep. I got a weird feeling like something didn't click. They were all asleep, right? I texted our house group chat to ask if anyone was in the kitchen. I felt stupid for even asking. 2 responded no, and they said the other 2 had been asleep. I knew it wasn't any of my roommates down there at that moment. I dialed 911 but didn't press call. I crept into my roommate's room across the hall. Thankfully, or maybe not thankfully, she didn't have her door locked. I whispered that I thought someone was in the house. She gave me the widest eyes ever and almost looked like she was going to cry. She didn't suspect anything, but for reference, a very bad area was only 2 doors down, where there was a shooting by an intruder just weeks earlier. She mouthed to make the call. The whole time we were dead silent. We didn't hear anything at all. I started to think I was seeing things after such a long day at work, and I regretted dialing 911 thinking I was going to look like an idiot when they showed up and I was just overtired. We explained what was going on, and they said they would send someone as soon as possible. And that actually does mean right away since it is a big, dangerous city. The police showed up and I didn't even want to go downstairs. But the operator confirmed it was them, so I did. The whole time I could swear the operator could hear my heart beating. The police came in and looked around. I thought, oh God, I look so dumb. They asked if there were any other floors, and we told them technically the basement, but it was padlocked, so not really. They checked the basement just in case, and, well, they were right. A man had been living in the padlocked basement. The lock had been pulled off the hinges and propped against the wall. We never looked at that, though. We rarely went out back. The guy had taken a comforter of one of my roommates out of the hall closet, had a mattress from God knows where, and his clothes. Well, he was the one moving in and eating all of our stuff. He would come out in the middle of the night to do it. He started getting more comfortable. I don't know if he was drugged out and forgot to clean up after himself, or if he didn't care. My roommates and I have pretty consistent schedules during the week, which probably led him to think that any time after about 12 was good to come out. We never slept with our individual doors locked, and that's what freaks me out most. He had access to any one of us at any moment, and we had no idea. When he was being arrested, I was the only one who went down to look. I don't know why I did. I wish I hadn't. I took a picture during the process of him being arrested to show my roommates, who were too afraid to go down. So yeah, let's never actually meet, dude. I once met up with an old friend of mine, a guy I'd known for a few years prior to our meetup in November 2017. I had actually met him on a dating site, but as time went on, our relationship became strictly platonic. There were no red flags, and my gut didn't warn me, so I completely trusted him. We met up in town behind a bus station on a grassy hill surrounded by trees and a tall wall. Our meeting was just to have a smoke, get a little high, and catch up. I had started smoking weed a few months prior, so I was still relatively new to it. He brought something new for me to try, purple haze. I wasn't anxious about it at all, as I completely trusted him and couldn't imagine he would lie to me. We chatted about work, our past relationships, and random stuff. About half an hour later, I began to feel extremely lightheaded and anxious. Suddenly, I had this strange feeling of discomfort and I really wanted to go home. When I asked him if I could leave, he offered to take me home, but I declined. He insisted again, saying, "Please let me take you home. You'll be safe with me, I wouldn't hurt you." I shook my head and replied, "No thank you, I can take myself home." As I started to walk away, I felt as if I was walking on a cloud. My head was dizzy and my eyesight became a bit blurry. I had never felt like this before, and soon I began to panic. As we made our way down the hill toward the bus station, I felt relieved because there were a lot of people around. I thought someone would step in if anything happened, but I became increasingly terrified of him. A horrible feeling in my gut told me to get away. When we reached the bus station, I told him I would call a taxi to go home. His tone shifted from nice to stern as he said, "I'm going to take you home now," and he began to pull at my jacket. I told him no and insisted I was going home on my own. He yanked my jacket harder, causing me to stumble against him. He pulled me close and said I didn't need to be scared of him. But I was terrified. I felt paranoid and struggled to see properly. I pushed him away, rubbed my eyes, and called for a taxi. He tried to snatch my phone and yelled in my face, "Do you ever listen? I'm taking you home." A few people stopped and asked if I was okay. All I remember was that I just wanted to go home. A lady kindly called a taxi for me and stayed to make sure I was okay, telling him to go home while she waited with me. When I got home, I paid the taxi driver and went straight to bed because it was the only place where I felt safe. That evening, I lay in bed for 5 hours, staring at the ceiling. I don't remember if I thought about anything or if my mom came in at any point. I just lay there until the paranoia and sick feeling began to wear off. I eventually looked at my phone and saw I had 32 missed calls from him, 10 voicemails, and over 50 messages. The messages were bizarre. He had sent around 20 asking where I was and when I got home. In one voicemail, he described a fantasy of taking me home while I was drugged, tying me up, blindfolding me, and wanting me to submit to him. I freaked out and blocked him on all social media, Instagram, Snapchat, Discord, and blocked his number. Before blocking him, I warned him that if he ever contacted me again, I would call the police. I heard nothing from him for a month until I received a text from an unknown number asking how I was. Since I hadn't given my number to anyone, I ignored it. Minutes later, I got another message saying they missed me and would see me soon. I asked who they were, but there was no reply. Creepy person who pretended to be my friend. Let's never meet again. This happened today and it really messed with me. I've been thinking about it all day and evening. I took my 5-year-old son and my 3-month-old daughter to the playground to meet a friend and her daughter. The playground has regular equipment, a huge parking lot, and a big grassy area, surrounded by trees. On the other side of the trees is some sort of development they're working on. The area is pretty rural, with twisty roads and random buildings. I've never really noticed or thought about this until today. When we arrived at the park, we met up with my friend, and another mom we know was there with her 2 girls. The only other people present were a dad with a little girl and a boy who looked to be between 10 and 12. The mom sat chatting and playing with my adorable daughter, having a good time. The kids began wandering off through the playground, doing their own thing. My son wanted to go on the seesaw, but no one else wanted to join him. I got up to help him, and the 10-ish boy came over and said, "Hi, do you want me to play with him?" It struck me as odd that he asked me instead of my son, but I said, "Sure, bud, go ahead." He got on the other side and started seesawing with my son. His demeanor was strange. He didn't smile, his voice was completely flat, and he didn't say a word to my son. Meanwhile, my son was happily chatting away. After a few minutes, I started walking back to my bench when I heard the boy begin talking to my son. Okay, maybe he's just shy around adults. I sat down and resumed my conversation with my friends. The dad walked near us, probably heading to his car, and I said, "Hey, it was really sweet for your son to offer to play with mine." Smiling at him, he looked at me and said, "He's not my son. I don't know who he is." He walked over and asked if I wanted him to play with my daughter and then just kind of followed us around until you guys got here. He laughed it off like it was weird. At that moment, a sense of unease washed over me. I looked over to the seesaws and they were gone. Panic surged through me as I jumped up, handed my daughter to my friend, and ran in that direction yelling my son's name. I spotted them walking almost toward the trees, which are not close, probably about a football field away from the play area. Fear gripped me as I ran as fast as I could, calling for my son. He turned around and started trying to walk back to me, but the little boy grabbed his arm, trying to pull him toward the trees. My son began saying, "Hey, let go of me." Usually my son's resistance would lead to trouble, as he has ADHD and gets aggressive when frustrated. But today, I was thankful for this quality. He began punching and headbutting the boy, who let go just as I reached them and ran into the trees. My friends were finally realizing something was wrong and stood at the edge of the play area, looking confused. My son was crying and I was shaking, unsure of what had just happened. I asked my son where he was going and he said the boy wanted to take him to see Ryan from Ryan's Toy Reviews, his favorite YouTube channel. Apparently, the boy had told my son that he knew where Ryan lived and asked if he wanted to go visit him and play. I don't understand the boy's intentions. Was it innocent? I don't know, it was a kid, but I still felt something was off. Edit. Just so everyone knows, I did call the police and report it this morning. They listened and asked questions, but they didn't want me to come in for a formal statement. I plan to call the school tomorrow too. This happened this past spring while I was working the front desk at a hotel. I had the afternoon shift from 3 to 10 p.m., so I mostly dealt with people checking in. I actually loved my job, but this was my first time working at a hotel. And it was the first time I experienced something like this, which made me more on guard. That night we had 2 rooms left available and I was eager to sell them quickly to ensure we were fully booked. To clarify for anyone unfamiliar with the hotel industry, front desk agents are typically authorized to discount rooms if it means it will bring in more business. While the discounts aren't over the top, my boss trusted us to use our discretion. Anyway, around 7 or 7:30 p.m., 2 young guys walked in. At that time, it was just me at the front desk. I wasn't sure where the maintenance guy was, so I felt a bit isolated. The guys looked normal, dressed nicely and seemingly friendly. They asked about room prices, and since we were running a bit pricey that night, one of the men stepped outside to call his buddy to see if the price was okay. I wanted to fill those rooms, so I started negotiating with the other guy. He was talking me down and I was being fairly generous with my discount offers. Finally, I said, "All right, I'll give you insert price if you guys give us your business tonight." After I said that, he leaned in closer and said, "Wow, you really want us here tonight, don't you?" I was shocked by the flirty tone but blamed myself for how I had phrased it. I can't remember my exact response, but at that moment the other guy came back in. The first guy told him that I had given them a discount, and then the friend wandered off to their room while the other guy lingered. Things started to get weird when he told me that the only reason he decided to stay wasn't the discount. He thought I was hinting that I wanted to hang out with him. He kept asking when I was off over and over. I remained professional and mentioned that I had a boyfriend, which I did, and wasn't interested. Eventually, he gave up and went to his room. About half an hour later, while I was on the phone, he wandered back down into the lobby wearing pajamas. He sat down on the couches opposite me, scrolling on his phone, and periodically looking up and smiling at me. I pretended to be very busy on the phone call, but when it ended, I called the hotel phone from my cell, trying to maintain the illusion of being busy. Unfortunately, it backfired when I received a wrong number call and hung up. That's when he made his move. He asked for my number and insisted he wanted me to come up to his room after my shift. I firmly said no. Then he suggested we meet after work to smoke weed together. I kept saying no and reminding him I had a boyfriend, and his response was always, "Well, he ain't here, girl, it's just us right now." I felt increasingly creeped out by his relentless advances. Finally, I found the courage to tell him to leave me alone or I would call security. This seemed to infuriate him. His tone changed completely. He became defensive and said he was just trying to get to know me. Then he aggressively leaned over the counter trying to grab me. I screamed, which only made him angrier. He yelled, "Shut up, bitch." At that moment, a family came out of the pool area, which startled him. He bolted out into the parking lot. The family noticed I was breathing heavily and had seen the guy run away, so they stayed with me while I called the maintenance guy to come. We eventually called the cops and my manager. After reviewing the security footage and hearing my story, they kicked him and his friend out. I was scared of those guys for a while after that. I really hope we don't meet again. This happened while I was in my early 20s. My best friend, KK, was always getting into risky situations. While she dabbled in various drugs, I was more of a pothead. I believe that when they say pot is a gateway drug, it's true to a certain extent, especially for those with addictive personalities. KK definitely developed an addiction issue later on. She had a knack for meeting people, often friending random folks on Facebook or Instagram. When she'd invite me to hang out, I'd act as a buffer just in case things didn't go well. One day, she showed up at my house unannounced and said, "Hey, let's go to my uncle's house. My aunt is there and she has some goods." Her aunt and uncle were known dealers in the area, and they lived just down the road. I went with her. When we arrived, she introduced me to this guy she met online, who went by the name Joey Crack. She showed me a picture of him, a wide-set man with a goofy red face, cornrow braids, face tattoos, and a gold grill. I laughed and said, "Wow, Kay, you really know how to pick 'em." Joey arrived soon after, walking right up and giving KK a hug, then kissing everyone else on the cheek. In this part of town, there wasn't much around, just houses, a school, and woods. The closest store was about 20 minutes away, so it struck me as odd that he had walked there. It was just me, KK, her aunt, and her aunt's friend. We lit up and began to smoke a bit. By this time, both aunts were already faded, so they take a few puffs and then go inside the house, leaving me, KK, and Joey outside. Joey started asking us questions about how we knew each other and what we did for a living. It was getting late, so I was telling her I was going to go home. She was like, "No, don't go yet." I told her I was tired and that Joey is weird, and he kept low-key hitting on me. Then she told me he had asked to sleep with her and wanted her to ask if I was down. I laughed it off and said that's crazy. After a bit more small talk, it became clear that neither of us was interested. It was just a hangout. The mood shifted. It felt eerie and quiet. Joey became reserved and shifty-eyed. I sat down for a while to please KK, but then I turned to Joey, knowing he had walked here and it was dark by now. "What are you about to do?" "Because I'm about to go home and Kay's coming with me." He replied, I just texted my boy, he's about to come get me." While he was texting, Kay was right behind him watching. Her eyes widened as she looked at me. Silent girl code for, "Dude, what the hell?" Kay broke the silence and said, "Hey, come help me get something from inside." I went with her. Once inside, she said she was going to call her uncle to give us a ride home. I asked why, considering my house was just a 10-minute walk. She revealed that while she was looking at Joey's text, he had sent a message to whoever was coming to pick him up, detailing all of us there. He noted that her aunts were too faded to do anything and mentioned our ages. He was telling his boy to come over to rob and assault us, and he called dibs on the blonde one. I was the blonde one. Every hair stood up on my body at the thought of some gross goon trying to have his way with me. I was furious that she had gotten me into this mess. We returned outside and continued the conversation with him so he wouldn't get suspicious. Kay casually mentioned that her uncle was on his way home. When her uncle pulled in, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Joey quickly departed into the darkness before his ride even showed up. Kay and I got a ride home from her uncle, during which we noted how weird Joey was. Later that night, as I was going to bed, I checked my Facebook and saw a request from Joey along with a message. "You're so pretty. I would love some alone time with you without your friend." The message ended with his number. I never blocked someone so fast in my life. After this, Kay didn't learn her lesson, but that's another story for another time. A week later, I saw Joey in the news. He was wanted for sexual assault, robbery, and drug possession. A bullet well missed on my part. Joey crack. Let's never meet again. I'm not sure if this even qualifies as creepy since it might just be a weird joke, but here goes nothing. My boyfriend and I went to a restaurant about 3 weeks ago. The couple sitting at the table behind us, let's call them Anna and Jack, had some trouble with their credit card while paying for their drinks. We assumed they were tourists because they were speaking English, which is not a language spoken in my country. The elderly waiter didn't understand anything they were saying, so I turned around and asked them what was going on in order to help them. For some reason, the guy's credit card was declined, and they only had euros, which is still not an official currency here, so they couldn't pay with cash, and they were trying to ask the waiter where the nearest ATM was so they could get some money to pay for their drinks. I then explained to the guy where he could find the ATM and told the waiter that the guy would be right back to take care of the bill. Since his girlfriend stayed in the restaurant and sat there waiting for him, I made a joke about how people over 50 can't speak a word of English in my country. We started talking, and we invited her to sit with us because you could tell she was really uncomfortable just sitting there alone. Anyway, about 10 minutes later, her boyfriend came back, paid for their drinks, and they invited us to get a beer with them because we helped them with the waiter. My boyfriend and I agreed, and we went to a nearby bar. We started talking, and it turned out that they had just moved here 2 days ago. I won't say from which country, but let's just say it was in Scandinavia. They moved into a house just 2 blocks away from our apartment. We talked about random stuff, and Jack said they had just watched the movie It that afternoon. It's like their favorite movie or something. I mentioned that I was really afraid of clowns, and I get really uncomfortable even talking about them. We each had 2 beers, and they both seemed really cool. So we told them we were having a couple of friends over on Saturday to play some board games, and invited them to come since they didn't know anyone in the city. They said that sounded awesome, and we exchanged phone numbers. So here comes Saturday. Our friends come to our place and we're waiting for Jack and Anna to arrive. Anna texts me that they are outside and have a little surprise for me. I buzz them in and they come up. They ring the doorbell and my boyfriend lets them in. I go to the hallway and they are both putting on Pennywise masks, waving at me while laughing. I got so creeped out that I started screaming, "What is wrong with you?" They just continued to laugh for 5 to 10 seconds before taking off their masks. They told me to relax and that it was just a joke. It was a very weird and awkward night after that. They left about an hour later because they had to take their dogs out for a walk. To be honest, everyone felt relieved they went home so soon because they both came off as rude and wouldn't even talk to our friends the whole night. She texted me around midnight saying she was sorry. As soon as I texted her back saying it was not a big deal and everything was fine, even though that wasn't really true, she sent me a gif of a sad clown with "sorry" written under the picture. I don't know what is wrong with both of them and why they thought messing with me like that was funny. What makes me even angrier is the fact that they were both so nice and seemed like a great couple to hang out with the day we met them, but they turned out to be rude and weird. Both my boyfriend and I blocked their numbers and we hope we don't run into them anytime soon.